Chapter 631 Dragon's Reverse Scale. How could this be possible? That was the question Sun Jia was asking himself in his heart as he looked into those black as night eyes. His memories went back to several years ago, when he was still a high school student. Back then, Sun Jia had a best friend who had the exact same name as the person in front of him right now. However, the truth was that the reason why someone like him who came from a prestigious family and whose future was guaranteed had befriended a young student whose parents were nothing more than a bunch of dirty cockroaches, who had to wallow in the dust to maintain their small existence, was purely and exclusively because that Bai Zemin was by far the person with the best grades of all. While Sun Jia was not worried about things like grades, since regardless of whether he graduated or not, his family would surely settle for some good position in one of the companies they controlled. His own pride and arrogance would not allow him to let himself look like a fool in front of others. Therefore, by befriending the person with the best grades, Sun Jia believed that he could at least not look like a complete idiot. In fact, Sun Jia was not wrong. After giving financial help to pay the hospital bills of the father of that young man named Bai Zemin after he had broken his leg at work as a result of an improperly adjusted load, Sun Jia easily succeeded in gaining his friendship. From this point on, everything was easy for Sun Jia. That Bai Zemin, which Sun Jia knew had some kind of weird capacity or bestial instinct, because Sun Jia could still remember how before every exam he would always point out with almost total accuracy the topics that the teachers would put on the tests. On one occasion, Sun Jia asked him how such a thing was possible, to which he responded that it was simply his instinct based on the number of times a subject had been pointed out by each teacher or the importance given to it in class, as well as the personality of each one of them. Be that as it may, Sun Jia's grades began to rise so easily that even he couldn't believe it. It was practically like knowing the questions for the next exam in advance. However, during his senior year of high school and after they had been friends for 2 years, Bai Zemin confessed that he had been in love with a girl from a different class for more than 2 years. To Sun Jia's surprise, the girl Bai Zemin was in love with turned out to be none other than Feng Tianwu, the person his parents had engaged him to, since the two families had been close for generations. After thinking about the matter for a couple of days, Sun Jia came up with a plan. Since high school was ending anyway and his grades were already so high, then why not play a little prank on his best friend? Sun Jia was quick to convince Bai Zemin to confess his love, even though the latter clearly had no experience with women whatsoever. Time passed, and just when there were a few months left for the year to end, Feng Tianwu and Sun Jia finally revealed the truth on the day when Bai Zemin confessed his feelings again and asked the girl to be his girlfriend after going on constant dates. Even to this day, there were times when Sun Jia laughed to himself as he recalled the innocent young man's look of despair back then. Although it was a bit of a problem not having him for the remaining months, the fun was really worth it. However, days before the final test, the nightmare that would follow Sun Jia for years to come occurred. On one of the nights when he had tiredly returned to the dorm after casually having fun with one of the most beautiful students in the high school after having won her heart, a person slipped in silently, and before Sun Jia could even scream in fear, a high-pitched, piercing cry broke out of his mouth as he felt the bones in his legs break into pieces. Sun Jia could still remember Bai Zemin's mocking voice as he looked at him with chilling eyes and whispered, "Our friendship was formed when my father broke his leg, so I'll break both of yours. Who knows, maybe you'll find a better friend now." In the end, Sun Jia had to his shame, use his family's connections to get into a good university, since as he was hospitalized he was unable to take the final entrance exam. Now, more than 3 years after that incident, Sun Jia could not believe his eyes. The appearance of the man in front of him was practically perfect, to the point where it was difficult to point out defects even if one hated him. The aura surrounding his body was that of a person who had long lived in a position of power and leadership. Compared to the barely average appearance of the young man in his memories and the normal poverty-stricken aura Sun Jia remembered, the two were worlds apart. There should be no point of comparison. However, Sun Jia would not forget those eyes even if someone burned his bones and turned him into ashes. The pain and humiliation he experienced were still engraved in his soul. Fortunately, the current Sun Jia was even smarter and more cunning than before. Therefore, even though his body was trembling, he clenched his fists and closed his eyes to suppress the growing fear and hatred in his heart. His Sun family was no longer practically an omnipotent being as before. In this world, Sun Jia was clear that a single person with enough power could crush everything. Although his father Sun Yun was the second most powerful person in the entire base, who could say for sure that Bai Zemin was not stronger? Sun Jia had already underestimated him once and suffered the consequences. He would not do it again. Therefore, he would wait for the right moment to strike a good blow. His eyes looked at Meng Qi and a weird light flashed in them. Although Sun Jia didn't know what relationship the cheap little bitch had with Bai Zemin, they seemed to be quite close. His lips curved imperceptibly before remaining silently in place. Of course, Bai Zemin had no idea that Sun Jia had identified him correctly, nor did he care. To him, the existences known as Sun Jia and Feng Tianwu were matters of the past that had nothing to do with the current him. As long as neither of them bothered him, Bai Zemin had no intentions of giving them even an extra glance, and if they bothered him then he would crush them until not even their bones were left, simple as that. There was no need to argue or much less, it was stupid and pointless. Imagine seeing a real lion roaring or hating an ant. Such things did not happen. The lion would simply crush what it needed to crush. Bai Zemin told the story of how he and his group came from the distant Yanqing district to Chongping district, after fighting for months. He said that after 2 days of chaos several students and teachers from the university formed a party and started heading south immediately instead of saying that they were stuck there for so many days, or else it would be hard to explain how they could get here so fast. The touching story of the young and old dying on battlefields to allow their allies to continue living always worked on people's hearts and much more on the hearts of people who did not really experience the fear of fighting zombies or mutant beasts. Therefore, after hearing how hundreds of friends died by being bitten to death just for the sake of containing several zombies, or how they were crushed by terrifying beasts just to save one more second for others, not a few tears were shed. Even Shangguan Bing Shui and the others who knew the truth of the matter could not help but be a bit moved. They looked at Bai Zemin as if he was a great actor and would really applaud if not for the situation they were currently in. The foundation of our China Renaissance is undoubtedly strong and robust. Here in the residential area we even have the treasure unbreakable field that Mayor Wu obtained after fighting to the death against a powerful beast. However, let's not forget that outside these walls there are billions of zombies and billions of mutant creatures. Bai Zemin said in a deep voice after finishing the fake story. Even if we are strong, even if our walls are high, we must not forget that considering the overwhelming number of enemies, only their numbers could forge a path of corpses to make their way here. Bai Zemin looked at Wu Keqian and seeing the latter nod, he sighed in his heart, before saying with false enthusiasm, "We, the China Renaissance, have the obligation to regain the lost lands and rebuild the motherland. Even if many brave warriors fall in battle, among whom I include myself, we will fall as heroes who forged the path of peace with their blood. We will be engraved in the history books and our memories will live forever. For China, for China, for the motherland, drive out the invaders." Bai Zemin's words had barely fallen when the more excited and easily manipulated young people began to shout loudly. Not long after, affected by the atmosphere, the older ones also began to roar at the top of their lungs to the point where the walls almost shook. The corner of Bai Zemin's mouth twitched slightly and he almost vomited as he looked at these stupid people in front of him. The 90% of those present were useless people who were good for nothing, but here they were shouting like idiots, which made him really want to slap them to death. Once the heat gradually died down, Wu Keqian stepped forward and whispered his thanks to Bai Zemin before taking charge. Bai Zemin said it was nothing but actually practically ran off the stage as he really didn't want to stay there. Big brother, if it wasn't because I know the truth you could have made me cry. Meng Qi covered her mouth and let out a chuckle as Bai Zemin approached her. These people sure could die of anger if they knew they shed tears over something that never happened and that you are trying to take everything away from them. Those who have some ability will keep their positions, and those who don't will not need to have privileges. Bai Zemin shrugged indifferently. The two were chatting quietly for a few minutes and they clapped their hands at Wu Yijuan's speech, but Bai Zemin suddenly frowned as he felt a steady stare practically prickling his back, and when he turned around he met none other than Sun Jie's eyes. Actually, Sun Jie had been staring at Meng Qi. He really was crazy for that girl and wanted her all to himself, but even his father had strictly told him not to bother her anymore. Therefore, it wasn't until several seconds after he had been staring at her that he noticed Bai Zemin's gaze, and his whole body trembled like crazy. Bai Zemin's expression sank as he noticed the possessive desire and almost naked lust in Sun Jie's eyes as he looked at Meng Qi. If there was one thing he would never tolerate, it was disrespect towards his loved ones in any way. However, Bai Zemin was sensible, so instead of rushing forward like an immature child, he looked at his sister and asked quietly, Meng Qi, do you know that man over there? Meng Qi looked at the place her big brother was pointing toward and her expression face turned blue. She hesitated for a moment before nodding gently, I know him. His name is Sun Jie. Bai Zemin nodded and looked at her as he calmly asked, do you like him or are you dating him? What? Meng Qi looked at him in shock and without even thinking about it shook her head as she said loudly, Big brother, are you crazy? How could I like that piece of human scum? I see. Bai Zemin nodded and patted her on the head before apologizing, I'm sorry if I offended you. Meng Qi said something but Bai Zemin wasn't listening anymore. The reason he asked that question before was only because if his sister liked Sun Jie then Bai Zemin wouldn't make things difficult for either of them. At the end of the day, while Bai Zemin still felt some resentment in his heart, this resentment came from the fact that he knew Sun Jie had utilized him for years and not because of what he and Feng Tianwu did to him. However, since there were no feelings involved, then there was no need to hold back. He did not care who the other party was, nor did he care whether the family of Sun Jie was powerful or close to the family of Wu Yijuan. His family was untouchable and inviolable, this was his greatest pride. A moment ago he was giving an ardent speech and now he was about to cause trouble. Every dragon had its reverse scale and Bai Zemin's reverse scale was undoubtedly his loved ones. Now that he had finally found them after months of insomnia and not being able to eat to his heart's content, any offense was not allowed, even a bad glance was not. Therefore, under Meng Qi's amazed eyes, he calmly walked through the crowd in Sun Jie's direction. Some things really could not be avoided even if one wanted to avoid them, and it seemed to be that Bai Zemin's destiny with his best friend was really strong. Chapter 632 Arrogant and Dominant. Shangguan Bingshui had been watching Bai Zemin all this time even while she was chatting with Wu Yijuan's mother. She was undoubtedly the most beautiful woman among all the presenters, while Sun Ling was the most seductive, so the number of eyes gathering in their direction was not particularly small. However, both Shangguan Bingshui and Sun Ling were clear about their charm and were used to receiving the stares of desire and love from the men, as well as the stares of jealousy and envy or hatred from the women. Therefore, as Wu Yijuan stood on the stage finishing her speech, Sun Ling whispered how lovely her princess looked, to which Shangguan Bingshui nodded. But although she had been paying attention to both Wu Yijuan and Sun Ling, Shangguan Bingshui's attention was mostly focused on Bai Zemin. At first, she did not understand where he was going, but when she saw his expression, Shangguan Bingshui's expression changed slightly. She tried to trace a line with her eyes following his gaze, and when she saw Sun Jie frozen in fear, Shangguan Bingshui's face turned slightly pale. She had found out a couple of hours ago that Sun Jie was actually the person who had been harassing Meng Qi, and it was also only recently that she had learned that the reason Bai Zemin's father had visited Wu Yijuan's house back then was to earnestly ask the Wu family to keep the man as far away from Meng Qi as possible. Shangguan Bingshui herself had had to tolerate Sun Jie's unseemly looks all this time, and apart from putting up with the fact that he was Wu Yijuan's cousin, another reason was that she did not want to ruin the plans that Bai Zemin had. However, it seemed to be that something bad occurred in these few minutes outside of her knowledge. Bingshui? What's wrong? Asked a confused Sun Ling, who was standing next to her as she noticed the change of color in her face. Shangguan Bingshui sighed and said quietly to no one in particular, "Now we can only hope that the worst doesn't happen." Sun Ling did not understand what Shangguan Bingshui was talking about, but soon she would. Sun Jie felt intimidated before the clearly taller and better built Bai Zemin when he saw him advancing in his direction with cold eyes. In fact, subconsciously and after remembering the past, Sun Jie couldn't help but take half a step back before he remembered the place he was in. Even if Bai Zemin did recognize him as well, Sun Jie didn't believe that he dared to act crazy in this place. Even if Sun Jie believed that he wasn't underestimating Bai Zemin by thinking that maybe even his father might not win and didn't want to openly provoke him until he had some certainty of his actual strength, he didn't believe that Bai Zemin would behave arrogantly in the presence of two second-order existences and so many powerful first-order soul evolvers. What are you doing?" he asked. Although he had calmed down a lot, in reality he couldn't stop his voice from trembling a bit. The walking of Bai Zemin had naturally not gone unnoticed, and it wasn't just Shangguan Bingshui who noticed it. With him being one of the three men who were stealing the most attention from the women aside from Chen He and Sun Jie himself, the number of eyes that gathered on his body was no small. Even Feng Tianwu was looking confusedly in that direction. However, Bai Zemin did not care about those eyes. After he arrived in front of Sun Jie, he paused for a moment before saying in a low but clear voice for those who were closest to the two of them to hear, "Sun Jie, I see you haven't learned to not mess with me even after I broke your legs years ago." Sun Jie's expression froze, and the people who caught a glimpse of Bai Zemin's voice had expressions of disbelief and shock on their faces. However, neither side even had time to say a single word before Bai Zemin made his move. He did not give Sun Jie time to say a single word, nor did he feel like listening to excuses. Bai Zemin believed what his eyes saw, and what he saw was Sun Jie looking at his beloved little sister with lustful eyes. That was all he needed to know. Bai Zemin moved his right hand at lightning speed, and none of those present managed to see what happened when a loud explosion echoed inside the hall, attracting everyone's attention and silencing any voices. Sun Jie's body was sent flying backward like a kite whose string had been cut after being slapped by Bai Zemin. There were even some people who were unfortunately in the way were also knocked down and fainted after spitting blood. Bang! Sun Jie's body hit the opposite wall of the hall before falling to the ground. His head was covered in blood and his eyes had gone blank after fainting from the powerful blow. If not for the fact that he was a soul evolver with some passive skills that enhanced his defense and treasures that increased his normal stats, his head would definitely have exploded into pulp. The place suddenly fell deathly silent. Everyone's expressions froze and they stared wide-eyed at the spot where Sun Jie's seemingly lifeless body lay, for several seconds before rigidly turning their heads to look at the young man who was now rubbing his right palm on his pants as if he had just touched something dirty. Meng Qi also froze, but she quickly recovered and her expression became indifferent. It was then when she noticed her mother and father walking in her direction. They both looked quite panicked and nervous about what was happening. "What happened?" Bai Delan asked in a low voice as he conveniently stood in front of his wife and daughter, as somehow he was sure that things were already beyond repair considering the situation. Meng Qi first took her mother's hand, who was as pale as a ghost. Then, she proceeded to explain everything in a calm manner. On the other hand, Wu Keqian, Wu Yijuan, Chen He, Sun Yun, Feng Tianwu, Feng Hong, and many other people looked at Bai Zemin in shock and disbelief. None of them understood what was going on. However, Sun Yun's expression soon turned white and his whole body trembled with anger as he realized that the person lying immobile several meters ahead was his son. Bang! The aura of a second-order existence burst out and everyone inside the hall immediately felt suffocated to the point where they fell to the ground. Even first-order existences like Bai Dilan turned pale as if they were suffering from some kind of sudden serious illness and could barely stand on wobbly legs. Fortunately for Bai Zemin's family, however, a gentle breeze blew past them and a beautiful figure appeared like a ghost. "You are." Bai Dilan helped his daughter and wife who were about to collapse before looking at the back in front of him in amazement. That silver-white hair and black dress was something that even he, a man dedicated to his family, admitted he could never forget, as the face of the woman whose back was currently facing him was simply too beautiful. "Thank you, Bing Shui." Meng Qi sighed in relief as her eyes filled with bitterness at the clear difference between the two. "Bing Shui?" Bai Dilan looked at his daughter in confusion. Since when had Meng Qi met such a powerful and beautiful figure? But Shangguan Bing Shui did not answer and simply nodded. Her expression was serious as she looked straight ahead and scrambled her brain trying to think for something to solve this. Bai Zemin looked at the person who was releasing his aura and was looking at him with burning anger. His eyes flashed with a hint of murderous intent as he noticed that his family might have collapsed if not for Shangguan Bing Shui, and as he looked at the man said coldly, "Old man, I don't care who you are, but if you don't retract your puppy aura in 10 seconds I'll rip your head off." His words amidst the silence were not different from a rumble of thunder in the middle of a hot summer day, and everyone looked at him in shock. However, when that shock they felt was soon swept away and replaced by eyes filled with pity. Even the beautiful ladies who had fallen for Bai Zemin's charm looked at him with pity. Who in the hall did not know that Sun Yun was the second most powerful existence in the entire base, just behind Wu Keqian? Sun Yun was one of the central pillars of the Chinese Renaissance and a kind of spiritual god in the hearts of many. Therefore, the fact that a random young man dared to say such words certainly aroused some disdain in them. "Good, good, good." Sun Yun shouted "good" 3 times, and his body began to tremble like crazy from rage. He looked at Bai Zemin as if he was a dead man and said loudly, "Not only did you dare to beat my son so cruelly, but you even dared to speak to me with such a defiant tone and threaten me. Today, I will let you live for helping my niece get here, but you will definitely not leave walking. You have 6 seconds left," was Bai Zemin's reply, completely ignoring the words of the man in front of him. Swoosh! After he finished his words, a flash of golden light suddenly illuminated the hall, and in the next instant, everyone was astonished to see that in the hand of the young man dressed in a suit now was an exquisite and elegant golden sword with mysterious opaque engravings on the guard and hilt. 4 seconds. Bai Zemin raised his sword pointing toward the ceiling and said casually, "Don't tell me I didn't warn you." If not for the fact that this man in front of him probably had some kind of relationship with Wu Yijuan, Bai Zemin might have killed him at this point. Sun Jia was hurt in such a way just by a peek, so Sun Yun would definitely have suffered even worse. In fact, he didn't listen to a bit of the garbage Sun Yun said, or else he would have known that he was actually Wu Yijuan's uncle. Sun Yun was as furious as a lion whose mating partner had been stolen. When had he ever been mocked like this? Never. Much less by someone of the young generation who could easily be his son. Enough. An angry shout suddenly rang out and an aura more powerful than Sun Yun's closed over him, suppressing his aura to a large extent. "Keqian?" Sun Yun frowned and said with annoyance in his voice, "What are you doing? Calm down for a second, let me settle this." Wu Keqian looked at Sun Yun with seriousness and asked in a deep voice. Then, he took out something from his pocket and threw it to him as he said, "You go and treat your son first, I'll give you an explanation later." Sun Yun looked at the small pill and after hesitating for a moment finally retracted his aura. He was a smart man and knew that his son had offended several people. Moreover, unlike most, Sun Yun noticed that the young man in front of him completely ignored the pressure of his aura, so while he did not fear, he also did not want to fight against an apparently powerful enemy unless there really was no other choice. Bai Zemin also kept his word, and upon seeing Sun Yun completely retract his aura, he snorted coldly. The golden sword in his hands turned into a flash of light that blinded normal people for an instant, and the next instant the sword was no longer in sight. Although Wu Keqian was really curious about that golden sword, he had a more important question, so he looked at Bai Zemin and said in a deep voice, "Bai Zemin, I respect and appreciate you. I really do. However, leaving aside the fact that Sun Jie is my nephew-in-law and Yijuan's cousin, I cannot allow such offenses. Therefore, if you don't give me an explanation, I'm afraid that." But Wu Keqian could not finish his words when a cold voice interrupted him sharply. "So if I don't give you an explanation, what?" Bai Zemin really respected Wu Keqian for his leadership. However, when matters involved those he truly loved, there was no respect that would stop him. In addition, he had realized something earlier, and so he was also disappointed and angry with Wu Keqian. So it was he who wanted explanations, no one else. Chapter 633 Different Kinds of Leaders. Everyone in the room was watching what was happening with eyes wide open. It was more than clear that the level of disbelief in the hearts of everyone present had reached levels too high for any of them to react immediately to what was happening before them. To begin with, the son of the second most powerful person in the entire base was slapped so hard that at this moment life or death was unknown. But not content with that, the young man who slapped the son of the second most powerful person in the entire establishment also called his father old man and openly and unconcernedly threatened him to the point of drawing his sword as if he was actually prepared to do what he was saying. Finally, now even the most powerful person in the entire establishment was being treated so rudely. Wu Keqian looked at Bai Zemin in astonishment, as he himself could not believe that this educated young man was actually speaking to him in that tone of voice. The person he had practically treated as his son-in-law was actually standing a few meters ahead of him openly, challenging him in front of so many people. However, the support Wu Keqian received from all the people and soul evolvers was far higher than the support Sun Yun received, one of the reasons why he was able to easily seize the power of the entire base. There were not a few people who were saved or helped by Wu Keqian. "How dare you talk to Mayor Wu like that?" There was an anger-filled roar similar to a lion's roar, followed by an explosion. Bai Zemin looked out of the corner of his eye and saw a first-order soul evolver that seemed to have transformed into something similar to a bull charging toward him at full speed. However, just as Bai Zemin raised a hand, he saw something out of the corner of his eye and stopped his movement before ignoring that soul evolver. Swoosh! A shadow swooshed through the crowd before stopping right in front of the soul evolver transformed into a bull, surprising him. But the soul evolver transformed into a bull didn't have time to stop at all or change his action when the person in front of him clenched the fist and punched forward. Bang! The soul evolver with the transformation skill, who was actually a powerful level 38 warrior, looked like a rag doll hit by a truck as his body was sent flying like a meteorite backward, destroying one of the tables and smashing through the wall before being buried under a pile of rubble. Life or death was unknown. "If you wake up after that, you can thank me for saving your life." Zhong De coldly snorted as he regained his stance and stood behind Bai Zemin as if declaring his posture. Swoosh! No one knew how or when, but suddenly a petite, nimble silhouette appeared on the stage, right behind Wu Yijuan. Before anyone could even react, the small silhouette that was like a shadow pulled out a dagger from somewhere and gently rested the blade of the weapon on Wu Yijuan's slender swan-like neck. "Yijuan! No!" Both Sun Ling and Wu Keqian screamed in terror, with their faces as pale as a sheet as they saw that the person who had sneaked in was actually Kai Jingyi, and at this moment she held her daughter's life in her hands. Even Wu Keqian, that was a powerful second-order warrior, did not trust to close a distance of several meters before the young assassin's hand moved. Wu Yijuan was already on the verge of tears from everything that was happening, so she didn't even notice when Kai Jingyi had appeared behind her. Her whole world seemed about to crumble before her eyes, so she couldn't care less about her life right now. However, Kai Jingyi's voice sounded like a whisper from behind her. "Wu Yijuan, don't worry. I'm doing this in order that you don't have to decide which side you'll take regardless of what happens next. It would be cruel for a girl to have to decide between the man she loved most in this world versus her family. Too cruel. Xietain did not want something like that to happen, so she acted on her own without waiting for orders from anyone. Lingxin stepped elegantly out of the crowd and with a faint smile stood next to Xietain. The place was silent as she looked at him and asked in a low voice, "Leader, finally got bored of playing the role of the lamb? Shut your mouth, Lingxin." Xietain said in a growling voice. "Okay." Lingxin let out a chuckle and started playing with her fingernails as if she didn't care at all about the fact that they were surrounded by soul evolvers who in an instant could be their enemies. Wu Keqian watched the scene in front of him with a pale face. Beside Xietain were two of the team members who arrived with him a week ago. At the gate, He was standing with a sky-blue energy bow like a soldier blocking entrance and exit. Wu Yijun was caught by Xietain, and last but not least, Shangguan Bingshui stood in front of Xietan's family with a complicated expression on her face. Even without anyone saying anything, everyone's posture was too obvious not to notice what was going on here. Yi Linger and Bai Dilan watched everything in disbelief while Meng Qi was calmly playing with an exquisite green ring with 4 root-like extensions growing from a tree-like token on the surface. "You planned this from the beginning, didn't you?" Wu Keqian looked at Xietain and sighed. However, to his surprise, Xietain shook his head and said calmly, "No. My original intention was to come to as peaceful an agreement as possible with you and the rest. Although I have no time to be wasting with petty games, you and your wife gave birth to a good daughter. Were it not for Wu Yijun, none within this hall would be where they are." Wu Keqian raised an eyebrow and said very calmly, "That confidence of yours really is great, because I have the strength to back it up." Xietain replied indifferently. Without giving Wu Keqian time to say anything else, he continued, "Mayor Wu, there is only one thing in this world that I do not tolerate, and that is for my family to suffer any kind of injustice. Therefore, for the sake of everyone here, I hope that you or someone inside this damn hall can give me a good explanation as to why that scum called Sun Jia was bothering my younger sister all this time." Bai Dilan's and Sun Ling's eyes flashed with surprise as they listened to Xietain. Bai Dilan even looked at Meng Qi and with his eyes inquired if she had said anything, to which Meng Qi hurriedly shook her head as she looked at her big brother in wonder. "How did he know? What are you talking about?" Wu Keqian frowned and pointed out, "Sun Jia hasn't gone near your sister again since she asked me." "I'm sure of it." Xietain suddenly frowned and a weird flash of light glinted in his eyes. For the entire previous week, one of the reasons Xietain had stayed at home without exploring the base was because his sister Meng Qi strangely did not want to leave the privileged area. Although this seemed somewhat unusual to him, Xietain simply thought that she did not have the heart to go to the poorer areas since he knew how kind-hearted Meng Qi was. However, when Xietain saw Sun Jia looking at Meng Qi with those eyes, he finally understood that the reason why Meng Qi didn't want to leave the privileged area was because of that little bastard who had probably been bothering her all this time. But now that Xietain heard Wu Keqian say that Sun Jia had not approached Meng Qi since she asked him to, a thought appeared in Xietan's heart which caused his expression to sink. He looked at Meng Qi and asked in a low voice but audible to all, "Meng Qi, could it be that the favor you obtained from Mayor Wu was spent so that little piece of Sun Jia to stay away from you?" Meng Qi hesitated as she didn't want things to escalate any further if possible. However, she knew that her big brother was far from being foolish, and even if she lied he would find out for himself, and by the time that happened things would get worse. Therefore, after several seconds of silence, she nodded her head silently. But contrary to the expectations of those who knew Xietain, he simply nodded and did not look angry. On the contrary, he looked at Wu Keqian and sighed as he said quietly, "You have really disappointed me. I thought you were a good leader, part of the reason I was giving you time as I wanted to see what kind of leader you are. But now I see that you're really no different than any other piece of trash. A person who out of fear of another cannot do his duty properly is not worthy to lead." Bai Zemin roared loudly, cutting off Wu Keqian's words. His voice was filled with anger that he barely seemed to be holding back. The ears of most of those present buzzed noisily and their heads felt dizzy as they took several steps back. But Wu Keqian surprisingly wasn't angry at Bai Zemin's words or tone of voice either. Instead, the man's shoulders slumped slightly and his expression turned bitter as he nodded, "You are right. It is precisely because I know that in this world I cannot lead that I told you earlier that I was willing to hand over my position to someone better qualified and who proves to be able to do better than me." Wu Keqian knew that the fact that a citizen of his faction had to use a valuable favor to ask for something that, by rule, Wu Keqian himself should fulfill was not something to be proud of at all and had always been a thorn in his heart. However, what could he do? Wu Keqian was not an all-powerful being, there were priorities and for the greater good, he had no choice but to ignore some things. "Remember what I told you before?" Wu Keqian calmly pointed out. "Even if I know there's contaminated water underground, unless I'm willing to let the entire ground shake and risk many buildings collapsing, I can only let that contaminated water continue to run. In this chaotic world, avoiding major chaos was the wisest option." "However, that's because you are weak," Bai Zemin said mercilessly. "A capable leader enforces his rules to the letter and anyone who does not follow them should be punished accordingly. Earlier, you spoke about separating the rotten fruits from the healthy ones, but in my eyes, it is nothing but foolishness." I, Bai Zemin, was no more than an ordinary student in the past, but today, I can firmly say that I am a better leader than you who has led all your life. "And what makes you think that?" Wu Keqian asked, still maintaining his composure. Bai Zemin stepped forward and declared, "Because I, Bai Zemin, have barely lost subordinates during my entire conquest from Yanqing district to Chongping district. In contrast to you who can only close an eye and turn a blind eye to what goes on within your own walls, any of the more than 30,000 survivors under my rule who dares to break any of the rules set by me and my government cabinet will face the consequences regardless of their power or rank." Chapter 634, Revealing the Truth. Final test. Bai Zemin's words were a great shock to the silence that reigned inside the hall as people immediately began to murmur and whisper while looking at each other in amazement. However, the most shocked was undoubtedly the people who knew Bai Zemin but did not yet know about his true identity. Bai Dilan and Yi Linger's eyes widened to the point of looking like spotlights as they stared at the handsome young man several meters ahead who with only a couple of friends was challenging the whole world. They knew their son better than anyone else. They knew that Bai Zemin would definitely not make up something so crazy in a situation like this, as someone smart like him surely knew that lies of such magnitude would only lead to the situation getting more complicated than it already was. However, looking at Meng Qi, who was standing silently and indifferently, the two parents realized that the two siblings were still hiding things from them and telling secrets to each other just like they did during their early teenage years. On the other hand, Sun Ling and Wu Keqian looked at Bai Zemin in shock. However, Sun Ling suddenly put two and two together and said loudly, "The human establishment that suddenly appeared in the north." Bai Zemin looked at her sideways and said in a cold voice, "That is correct. I am the leader of all the people north of this place." He looked at Wu Keqian, who was also looking at him in shock, and said with a hint of disdain in his voice, "It's just that, unlike this place, the power of my transcendent faction properly rests in my hands. My leadership seat is not a cardboard throne and the crown on my head is not a paper one." Wu Keqian ignored Bai Zemin's words and suddenly looked at his daughter Wu Yijuan. She, despite being under threat of a dagger, didn't seem nervous for her life at all. Rather, Wu Yijuan seemed on the verge of tears at the overall situation. "You don't tell me." Wu Keqian muttered more to himself than to anyone else as he stared at his daughter in total disbelief. He couldn't believe that the daughter he raised, spoiled, cuddled, hugged, and showered with affection for years was actually betraying not only him but the entire Wu family. "Uncle Wu, instead of blaming Yijuan, you should be grateful to her. A voice that contained some regret amidst the coldness sounded in the middle of the hall, and everyone's eyes automatically moved to the black-dressed beauty with silver-white colored hair. Wu Keqian could not help but smile with scorn and said with some disdain, "Are you asking me not to blame my daughter for betraying her family? You want me to be grateful to her for bringing and hiding a lion in the courtyard of our house?" His body was trembling, and it was clearly not only from pain but also from anger. How could he not feel betrayed? His own blood was stabbing him in the back. Sun Ling was staring at her daughter intently, but in contrast to Wu Keqian, what she felt was pity and understanding to a certain extent. Then, after a moment of silence, she asked in a voice that although it was low, the silence helped it to be heard by everyone, "Yijun, surely you have your reasons for doing what you are doing." Wu Yijun tried to open her mouth and say something, but that small movement was all it took for the tears she was barely holding back to start raining down on her beautiful face. She brought both hands to her chest and began to take deep breaths as if she was having trouble breathing, as if a large rock was weighing down inside her chest. "The reason she is doing all this is for the good of everyone here," Kai Jingyi said in a playful voice. If it wasn't for Wu Yijun, everyone in this establishment would only have two options. The first option would be unconditional surrender. As for the second option, I think everyone here can imagine it. Nangong Lingxin looked at Wu Keqian and sighed as she calmly said, "Mr. Wu, even if we put aside Bai Zemin, Shangguan Bingshui alone has the ability to overwhelm this entire faction in a matter of a couple of hours at most." As if to prove that what Nangong Lingxin said was true, the exquisite body of Shangguan Bingshui swayed gracefully and in an instant disappeared from her previous position, leaving behind an afterimage. In the next instant, and unnoticed by anyone, she was behind Wu Keqian with an ice sword pointed directly at his back. Wu Keqian froze and his pupils trembled in shock as he felt the very slight killing intent behind him. He couldn't believe it. Even if he was distracted by everything that was going on, a second-order existence like him shouldn't be able to be ambushed so easily. Suddenly, that slight killing intent disappeared and Shangguan Bingshui was once again in her previous position. She looked at him with a complex expression on her face as she said in a low voice, "Uncle Wu, now do you understand? The reason why Yijun did all this and even went to the trouble of bothering Bai Zemin, even though this could bring a lot of trouble to him which could become an impediment for him to love her in the future, is because you have no possibility of victory." The face of Wu Keqian was white as a sheet and he found no words to refute. If Shangguan Bingshui was strong and fast enough to appear behind him and threaten his life so easily, then how terrifying the person leading her must be? The very thought of it made his heart tremble with fear. Bai Zemin looked at Wu Keqian and said more calmly now, "I had planned to take one more week to prove to you that I am worthy to lead, and then I would challenge you to a small duel to show you that I have the power to carry the weight on my shoulders. At first, it was because your daughter is not only an important subordinate but I also consider her a precious friend. However, as the days went by you gradually won my respect." After a pause, he shook his head and said coldly, "However, at the end of the line you disappointed me. Now, I'm afraid I don't have the patience to wait anymore." The entire hall was silent and even Sun Yun did not dare to say a single word after seeing Shangguan Bingshui's casual display of power. Everyone had realized that many things were about to change and the last thing they wanted was to antagonize this small but terrifying power that seemed to be rising without impediment. "What do you plan to do after conquering this place?" Wu Keqian suddenly asked, sounding calm and looking at Bai Zemin with clear eyes. Bai Zemin looked at him with a serious expression on his face and stated confidently, "After conquering this place, I will divide my troops to the east and west while I and a smaller number of soul evolvers head south in search of the family of Bing Shui and Chen He. My goal is to reunite the humanity of our country under a single rule within the next 10 months at the most." 10 months. Several guests gasped in shock as they looked at Bai Zemin with wide eyes. "Nonsense!" Sun Yun shouted from a corner after Sun Jie's condition stabilized. He looked at Bai Zemin as if looking at a crazy man and remarked, "You want to conquer China in 10 months? T. China was one of the largest countries in the world even before the expansion of the earth, and even before the expansion, it would be impossible for a power to manage to gather all the Chinese in less than 10 months, let alone a world whose natural size grew almost 4 times its former size. For all of you, it is impossible, because you are weak. Xietain said indifferently. His voice was neither high nor low, there was no pride or disdain as he calmly said, but I have the power and ability to achieve it. In just a couple of days, I slaughtered over 20 million zombies and over 20,000 mutant beasts, among which there were almost 10 second-order existences and 2 third-order existences. I doubt there are many powers of such magnitude in China, which means it will be easier to conquer them. 20 million. Sun Ling whispered, and suddenly her body trembled as she subconsciously exclaimed in terror, "The zombies of the Eastern Dragon's Back." The zombies from all the cities, towns, and villages surrounding the north and south of the Eastern Dragon's Back were gathered under the main leadership of a zombie over the level 100. Xietain said as he looked at Sun Ling calmly, "After slaughtering half by myself in about 2 days and 2 nights, I and the 7th princess of the Eastern Sea formed an alliance due to certain circumstances and wiped out the rest of the creatures on the bridge, which finally allowed me and my faction to make it this far." Xietain ignored everyone's reaction and didn't care if they understood what he was talking about or not. He stared at Wu Keqian, who was also staring at him, and demanded in a firm voice, "Surrender. Although I am disappointed with you and your family, Wu Yijun has nothing to do with this. Besides, regardless of being my friend, she is one of the central pillars of my transcendent faction, so as long as I am still standing, you and the rest of your family will be able to live lives of luxury." Wu Keqian looked down before looking at Xietain and calmly saying, "And if I refuse?" Xietain narrowed his eyes and a glint of coldness flashed in them as he slowly said, "If you refuse, even though I am not going to kill you, I'm afraid you probably won't be able to stand up again for at least a couple of years." "Father, no!" Wu Yijun shouted, finally finding strength. She looked desperate as she anxiously cried, "Surrender. Just give up. You can't win." She knew very well how terrifying Xietain was. She knew that if it weren't for her, he would have long since continued on his path of conquest after crushing any resistance that stood between him and his goal. He had always been doing it this way from the beginning, and each next result was each time more crushing than the last. "Uncle Wu, please just surrender." "Chen," he said from the distance. He sighed and shook his head as he said with complicated emotions, "You have no way of knowing how strong Xietain actually is. I know it will sound crazy, but to say that his entire existence is a huge living and moving nuke is not exaggerated at all." However, Wu Keqian did not seem to listen to outside advice. He looked at Xietain and suddenly he disappeared from his previous position. The ground where Wu Keqian stood a moment ago exploded as a terrifying air pressure sent all the nearest people flying amidst desperate screams and cries. As for Wu Keqian, I really can't win." His voice was complicated, but there was no bitterness or regret. Xietan's eyes were as calm as a lake as he gazed indifferently at the man less than 2 meters ahead. Wu Keqian had his right leg slightly bent forward and his left leg fully extended behind his body. His torso was bent forward and his right arm fully extended while his clenched right fist was pointing toward Xietan's head. "I guess I passed the test?" Xietain asked indifferently. His left arm was pointing 90 degrees upwards, and in his clenched fist was Wu Keqian's hand that, regardless of how much strength he put into his arms, could neither advance nor retreat. Wu Keqian raised his head and his face was slightly contracted due to the pain transmitted from his right hand. He could feel his bones creaking slightly, and it was clear that the young man in front of him was holding back, so as not to break them into dust. Wu Yijun finally couldn't stand when she saw this, and her knees gave out, so she began to fall to the ground. Fortunately, Kai Jingyi quickly supported her to keep her from falling and looked forward with a serious expression on her face. The whole place was deathly silent. "You don't kill me even after I attack you?" Wu Yijun's father asked with calmness in his voice. He even smiled unburdened and said indifferently, "If you have mercy on your enemies, I don't think you can achieve your goal within the estimated time frame." Mercy. Xietain whispered, and his eyes flashed with a hint of self-mockery as he said quietly, "I'm afraid the word mercy no longer has anything to do with me, Uncle Wu. It hasn't for some time now." Xietain had slaughtered hundreds of millions. Among those he killed were no shortage of children, infants, and old people. Regardless of whether it was indirectly or not, it was certain that he was responsible for those deaths. For some reason, the hearts of Bai Dilan and Yi Linger ached at the sight of their son's somewhat bitter expression. Both parents, just like any sane parent, wanted nothing but the best for their child. Unfortunately, both were weaker than fate, so they had no ability to protect him. Only Shangguan Bing Shui understood Xietan's feelings to a certain extent because only she was by his side during the invasion of Oblong World. Therefore, she looked at him with complicated eyes and couldn't help but bite her lips softly. "Uncle Wu? I thought you would call me Mayor Wu from today onwards." Wu Keqian chuckled. "The reason you are still alive is because your previous attack didn't contain even a hint of murderous intent." Xietain was very sensitive to things like murderous intent, so he knew that Wu Yijuan's father wasn't even aiming to really hurt him when he attacked him just now. "And the reason why I even stopped myself when I wanted to break your hand is because just now one of the people I love the most in the whole universe asked me to have mercy on you." Xietain added ironically as he closed his eyes and breathed in the scent of roses that hugged him from behind. Ignoring Wu Keqian's questioning look, Xietain looked at him with serious eyes and demanded for the last time, "Surrender." "I will not say it a third time." However, even though Xietain had just proved to have enough power to crush him, Wu Keqian shook his head again. Then, he looked at him with a faint smile and pointed, "You just proved that you have the strength. Now, prove to me that you have the ability to lead." Wu Keqian smiled carefreely and continued, "If you prove to be able to lead better than me, then I will gladly hand everything over to you and even will help you make everything go smooth and clean, which will make things a lot easier for you. I guess handing everything over to my future son-in-law isn't too bad, anyway. Ha 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 ha. Who knows, maybe one day I can say that the daughter of me, Wu Keqian, is actually the wife of the most powerful man in all of China and the hero who freed our race from the cliff." Chapter 635 Feng Tianwu's Worries. Xietain really didn't know how to feel after hearing Wu Keqian's words. Being honest with himself, Xietain knew that he was still angry with the man in front of him because due to his own incompetence his little sister had had to bear the harassment of a minor piece of trash. However, after the flame of anger slowly began to die down and he began to think more deeply, he realized that it wasn't really that easy. Not everyone was him. Wu Keqian had sacrificed his own potential and limited his future for the sake of forging a place as safe as possible in times of chaos, while humanity gained time to adapt and prepare for the sudden changes they had to face and would still have to face from now on. Just based on this fact alone, Xietain knew that Wu Keqian was neither a bad person nor a bad leader. At the end of the day, what kind of selfish leader or bad person would put others before himself? None. However, Xietain was used to the leader's word being heard. Therefore, in his eyes, any kind of problem that arose was not the fault of the subordinates or the people, but was proof of the incapability of the one who led them. Therefore, even though he was angry with Wu Keqian, he understood him as well. The two were two different men and therefore the vision of leadership they had was different. Moreover, it was true that, unlike Xietan's overwhelming power, Wu Keqian did not have all the power of the Chinese Renaissance faction completely in his hands. Therefore, it was natural that he could not do everything well as he would probably wanted to. Hearing that Wu Keqian was actually willing to hand over his leadership position to the young man before him, everyone looked at each other in shock. However, no one said anything, even Sun Yun did not open his mouth to object even though he was clearly not very happy with this deal. The most powerful person in the entire base was not even able to land a blow on the other side despite attacking. Abruptly, what else could they do? Fight to the death against Bai Zemin? Wouldn't that be courting death? You want me to prove to you that I'm a better leader than you? Bai Zemin frowned and asked, calmly, how am I supposed to do that? Just so you know, but I don't plan to waste any unnecessary time. I need to get stronger as soon as possible after all. Don't worry. If everything goes well, within 4 days at most the whole base will be in your hands. Wu Keqian assured with calmness and confidence in his voice. Bai Zemin slowly released his grip on Wu Keqian's hand, letting the man sigh in relief and rub his wrist as he looked at him with hidden bitterness and said in a low voice, boy, you really are cruel. You even dare to mistreat your father-in-law like this. Bai Zemin shook his head without any intention of meaningless chatter. Instead, he got straight to the point. What am I supposed to do? Chongping Silver Mountain. Wu Keqian said those 3 words aloud and while looking at Bai Zemin stated, you will lead the troops in this operation. If you really are as strong and capable as you and your comrades say you are, then you shouldn't have any problems, or yes? No problem. Leave it to me. Bai Zemin nodded in confidence and agreed without hesitation. Bai Zemin already knew beforehand that a rather large operation would soon take place, he just didn't know the exact location yet. Therefore, he was not surprised after hearing what Wu Keqian's request was, and in fact, he was relieved since if it was just to lead the troops then everything was easier. Bai Zemin really wanted Wu Yijuan's father not to become his enemy. Apart from the fact that Wu Keqian was Wu Yijuan's father, the man was a powerful second-order powerhouse, which meant that he was brave and could fight well against enemies. Besides, it would be thousands of times easier for Bai Zemin to take control of the Chinese Renaissance, and everything would be much smoother with the unconditional support of the current leader. Then I will prepare the documents for you. Documents? Bai Zemin frowned slightly. This operation is not as simple as it seems. You will naturally understand when you read the reports. Wu Keqian said in a deep serious voice. All right. When shall we leave from here then? Tomorrow at noon. I've already prepared everything, so there's no need to worry. I see. Then, Bai Zemin and Wu Keqian seemed to go into a world of two and completely ignored all the people who were looking at them in shock. A moment ago, the situation seemed extremely serious, and it took only a spark for the bombs that seemed to have been secretly planted underground to fully explode, but now the hot air cooled to natural room temperature and there was no longer any trace of animosity whatsoever. What the hell was going on here? That was what everyone was wondering. In reality, both Wu Keqian and Bai Zemin had their reasons for doing what they were doing. However, the 2 men had come to a tactical agreement all because of one person, and that person was none other than Wu Yijuan. Bai Zemin did not want Wu Yijuan to suffer, and furthermore, he would not have the face to see her in the future if by conquering a camp he ended up fighting to the death against her family. At the end of the day, she was more than a subordinate as she was in the past. But Wu Yijuan didn't care what reasons the 2 men might have. All she cared about was that everything seemed to have worked out somehow. She finally sat down on the ground without caring at all about her image, and a great sigh of relief slipped from her trembling lips, expelling the cloud of bad feelings that choked her chest. Her beautiful face was still pale, but slowly the color was returning to her as her heartbeat calmed down. Thank the gods, she whispered without realizing it. Kai Jingyi exchanged glances with Zhong De and Nangong Lingxin. The 3 of them also looked relieved as they also let out their own sighs of relief. None of them really wanted to clash against the family of an ally, as it would be really awkward to face Wu Yijuan in the future. She was well liked by everyone in the Transcendent faction as she was one of the hardest working people. In fact, Wu Yijuan was the most liked person by the citizens right after Bai Zemin, as she was the one who showed her face in public most of the time since the government cabinet was practically under her complete control and command. Shang Guanbing Shui and Shen he also sighed in relief and finally relaxed greatly as if a great weight had been lifted off their shoulders. The 2 of them were very close to Wu Yijuan's family for obvious reasons, and just like her, they were also in a difficult position just now. Brat, you'd better blurt out everything you know. Yilinger suddenly caught Meng Qi by the ear and lightly squeezed it while with her free hand she patted her chest. She thought her heart was going to stop a moment ago, but fortunately, the worst didn't happen. But Meng Qi didn't open her mouth to blurt out the secrets she knew even when her ear was turning slightly red. So Yilinger, who couldn't bear to punish the girl, finally let her go after a few stern words. Bai Dilan also let out a big sigh of relief as he looked at his son several meters ahead with pride but also with some regret. That boy who had been under his protection all his life had left the nest a few years ago. It had only been a few months since he had last seen him, but that baby hawk had now become a huge predator with wide wings capable of protecting from wind and rain those who once used their wings to take care of him. A few more minutes passed and after a few simple but deep words, Wu Keqian agreed to send the necessary documents to his home early tomorrow morning, to which Bai Zemin agreed. Naturally, Bai Zemin was about to approach and leave with his family as the party was clearly over when he suddenly stopped and looked to a far corner where a person lay on the ground like a dying dog. Mr. Sun, you are Yijuan's maternal uncle, so even if we can't get along, I hope we can work together for personal benefits, he said in a voice clear enough to be heard by all. His eyes flashed with a hint of coldness as he said with a frightening calm, however, for that to be possible, I hope you will leash and educate your son well from now on. Sun Jia was hospitalized in the past by me after he betrayed my trust in the lowest possible way, and now he will probably have to stay in bed for several days for harassing my family. But there will be no third. Do you understand what I mean? Everyone present could feel the slight murderous intent at the end of his sentence. Among them, of course, Sun Yun did not miss this little factor. Even though the man was dissatisfied with the tone of voice of the young man several meters away, he was a man who knew perfectly well that when the bridge was low one had no choice but to duck one's head. It is understood, he said, nodding deeply. Sun Yun was aware that sometimes his son Sun Jia did bad things. However, like any parent, he also wanted the best for his child. The problem was that sometimes, showering our children with love and protection was not necessarily the right thing to do. Bai Zemin, how do you know my nephew from the past? Sun Ling asked suddenly. How could she not be interested? It could be said that everything that had happened tonight was practically 90% Sun Jia's responsibility after all. That doesn't matter anymore. Bai Zemin shrugged and replied indifferently. Sun Jia was a friend, then someone I hated, but now he's nothing more than an insignificant ant in my eyes. An ant I'm not willing to give a second glance to as long as he doesn't provoke me. Bai Zemin did not wait for a response from Sun Ling and looked at Wu Yijuan as he said in a somewhat guilty voice, I'm sorry to ruin it. This was supposed to be a party for you, but in the end this is how it all ended. Wu Yijuan looked at him with a relieved smile on her face still wet with tears. She shook her head gently, and as she looked at him with her eyes slightly swollen from crying, she said softly, It's okay. I'm glad that in spite of everything things didn't turn out so bad. Thank you for all of this. It means a lot to me. Bai Zemin thought about what to say for a moment, but in the end, he simply smiled kindly at her and nodded before turning around and walking to his family. And now how am I going to explain all this? Bai Zemin couldn't help but force a smile into his heart as he noticed the way his parents were looking at him. It was clear that he couldn't escape even if he wanted to. Feng Tianwu was stunned as she watched all the events unfold like a spectator unable to intervene at all. Her iron expression that rarely changed was the vivid description of the word disbelief and the word surprise as she stared at the back of the person she wanted to apologize to disappearing into the distance. She wanted to step forward and stop him to apologize honestly, but her brain that was still processing everything she had just heard and seen did not allow her body to move. Even stepping forward was not possible. It wasn't until many minutes later that she finally came out of her daze after hearing her father's voice, calling out to her from beside her. Tian Wu, are you all right? Feng Hong asked, with a frown. It was rare to see his firm and stern daughter show such a shocked expression on her face, so he couldn't help but worry. Actually, Feng Hong was at ease with everything that was going on. Even if the faction changed its leaders, it did not affect him to any great extent since his Feng family was not particularly allied with any other family. With his and his daughter's power, he was sure that the new government to come would have no problem accepting them as valuable fighters, and thus the benefits they would receive would surely be no less than what they had at present. Feng Tianwu hesitated for a moment before shaking her head. "Father, we should go too," she said, noticing that all the guests were leaving after saying their goodbyes with complicated expressions on their faces. Feng Hong nodded in agreement and led his family of 3 to bid farewell to Wu Keqian and the others. Regardless of whether the base changed its leader in the future or not, it was a fact that Wu Keqian was destined to be someone big not only because of his strength but also because his daughter Wu Yijun clearly had a peculiar relationship with the young man named Bai Zemin. Standing next to her family and with a smile on her face, Wu Yijun watched as her father said good night to the guests and apologized for today's awkward moment. Wu Keqian even made use of the 4 soul evolvers with healing type skills to help those who had suffered some minor wounds during the whole event and also promised to reward them later. Suddenly, however, Wu Yijun felt someone staring at her. Being sensitive to all kinds of stares, she turned and met the clear eyes of a woman slightly younger than herself but whose beauty did not lose much to herself. For some reason, Wu Yijun felt that this young beauty's eyes reflected many complicated emotions as she looked at her. However, Wu Yijun was sure that she did not know her from anywhere, so all she could do was incline her head with a big question sign on her face. But Feng Tianwu simply shook her head without saying anything. Her opportunity to apologize had passed once again, but this was not a good occasion to do it either, so she would do it during the mission that would start tomorrow, since she was also one of the soul evolvers that would be mobilizing. The only thing that worried Feng Tianwu a bit was that her apology might not be seen in the honest way she wanted to apologize, as the current Bai Zemin was clearly far from being that ordinary young man from a normal family that he was in the past. Chapter 636 Feng Tianwu, Stone Heart Hidden Requirement. The next day, it was around 12:30 noon when a large caravan composed of 5 buses, 10 off-road trucks, 4 jeeps, a cargo truck, a fire truck, and a tanker truck left from the south gate of the base where the Chinese Renaissance faction was settled. The soul evolvers and soldiers guarding the south gate watched nervously and intently as the fleet of about 20 vehicles modified to withstand the ongoing wars on this harsh world moved farther and farther away until they became a distant dot on the horizon before finally disappearing. Standing on top of the southern wall, 2 men stood side by side, and under the respectful gaze of all the nearby soldiers and soul evolvers they also silently watched until the caravan of vehicles disappeared into the distance. "Keqian, didn't you say you wanted to see how that young boy led?" Sun Yun asked curiously as his eyes were fixed in the distance. Wu Keqian gave his brother-in-law a sidelong glance before turning his attention to the nothing before him as he calmly said, "There's no need for me to be there. Your sister can watch for me. Besides, I doubt that a man my daughter chose is a useless and incapable man." While Wu Keqian wanted to go on this mission trip personally as there were very important things that needed to be carried out, the base could not go that long without a second-order existence holding down the fort. Before last night's party, everything would have been fine as Sun Yun could fulfill that role while Wu Keqian was going to lead the expedition himself. However, with Bai Zemin's parents staying at the base, Wu Keqian could not risk his brother-in-law doing something crazy, as even if Bai Dilan was strong there was no way he could stop him. While it was unlikely, since Sun Yun was a smart man, Wu Keqian would rather be safe than sorry. Of course, Wu Keqian did not know that the reason Bai Zemin felt comfortable leaving his father and mother at the base even though he would be away during this time was because his family was not unprotected at all. In fact, even if Wu Keqian himself dared to attack them, it was highly likely that he would lose his life in the process. There was no way Bai Zemin would leave without securing his loved ones first. let alone after all the commotion he caused the past night. Sitting in the military jeep leading the front load, Xietain was rereading the documents he had already read earlier with a serene expression on his face. Chongping Silver Mountain was very close to Xingshou town and was composed of an extension of mountain ranges, approximately 60 kilometers long, a place loved by cyclists and also by tourists since near the scene there were several restaurants serving local food, a beautiful natural waterfall, 13 mausoleums, and many other truly picturesque sights to be seen. However, with the expansion of the earth, that mountain range probably expanded to over 250 kilometers long and all the beautiful buildings had collapsed. The thing was that actually, Chongping Silver Mountain was also known as Silver Mountain Pagoda Forest since in the middle of the mountain ranges 5 large pagodas had been built during the Jin dynasty. With over 500 years of history, it was no exaggeration to say that the 5 pagodas were a national treasure, that even with the passage of time stood firm. But how could those pagodas not have collapsed when the expansion earthquake shook the entire world? Xietain frowned slightly as he came to this part of the report where there were several photographs taken by unmanned drones. It's also the first time I've heard of such a thing, interjected suddenly Wu Yijuan, who was sitting in the front seat next to the driver. She was resplendent today, as for the first time in days she was finally able to get a full night's sleep without being afraid of tomorrow. Except for the buildings in the privileged area that is protected by the treasure that Uncle Wu obtained, all the other buildings should have collapsed several days ago. Shangguan Bing Shui, who was sitting to the left of Xietain, pointed out. Xietain closed the folder with papers and looked at the person sitting on his right. Meng Qi, what do you think? In fact, instead of bringing his father with him, Xietain chose Meng Qi. He had 3 reasons why he made this decision. First, by bringing Meng Qi with him he could prevent Sun Jia from having some crazy thoughts. While Xietain was not scared of problems, if he could avoid them then it would be the better. Second, by leaving Baidilan together with his mother who for obvious reasons could not come, Xietain felt more at ease as the power of Baidilan was already strong to begin with, not to mention after Xietain shared with him several passive skill scrolls and some powerful active skill scrolls that could not be ignored. Finally, the third reason was that Meng Qi would probably be of great help on this trip. At least that was how Xietain felt. Meng Qi was silent for a few seconds before she carefully said, I don't know much about this world since in contrast to all of you most of my time was spent within a safe perimeter rather than exploring. But in my opinion, it is possible that there is a treasure or a magic circle protecting the structures in that place. I agree. Wu Yijuan nodded from the front. The 5 pagodas are located in the middle of mountain ranges, that is, in the middle of forests. It's weird that they haven't been knocked down by some crazy mutant beast or by the shockwaves resulting from the battle between a few creatures. Shangguan Bing Shui, Meng Qi, and Wu Yijuan continued to explore different theories and give their opinions on the matter. The 3 women were clearly getting along well and were comfortable with each other thanks to all of them being smart and bright-minded. Why do I have to drive? Chen, he complained under his breath as he glanced in the rearview mirror occasionally. Xietain forced a smile and said without knowing what to do, weren't you the one who kicked out the previous driver? Take care of your stuff, man. Chen, he muttered something to himself and stepped on the accelerator as if he wanted to release his frustration by speeding up. Unfortunately, after being modified there was no vehicle that could exceed 60 kilometers per hour, so no matter how hard he pushed the pedal there wouldn't be too noticeable changes. He. A chuckle sounded like a silver bell swaying in the spring breeze, attracting Xietan's attention. He looked to his right only to find his little sister's dark hair, as at this moment Meng Qi was looking with much amusement at something outside the vehicle. She even raised a hand and waved prettily. Xietain looked up to see what was going on, and when his eyes finally saw beyond the glass the corner of his mouth twitched a couple of times. Next to the military jeep was an open box SUV in the back. The driver had a look of helplessness on his face because what he was carrying in the back was not weapons, food, tents, or even people. A dog-like creature that was clearly too big to be a dog was sitting up while turning its head to the left. Its snow-white fur danced furiously in the wind, as did the long tongue out of its mouth that let drool spittle everywhere. Its blue eyes shone brightly as it peered into the military jeep and occasionally let out a high-pitched bark as if it wanted to get attention. Big brother, little Snow must be happy now that she finally got out of the house after being locked up all this time, Meng-Chi said, still looking at the animal and waving at her with her little hand. I guess. Bai Zemin didn't know whether to laugh or cry, but not because of the giant dog, but because behind him he could feel two excited eyes looking past him. Bai Zemin was sure that if he turned around now, he would meet the bright eyes of Shangguan Bing Shui looking intently at little Snow. The distance between the Chinese Renaissance base and Xingshou town was about 100 kilometers in the past, but with the expansion of the Earth, that distance grew to about 400 kilometers. Therefore, the caravan of just over 20 modified vehicles took about 7 hours to get there. By the time the 370 soul evolvers and 200 soldiers got out of the vehicles after arriving at the now ruined town, it was already after 19:30 p.m., only about 40 minutes before the sun went down completely and the night began to ascend over their heads. Bai Zemin immediately ordered them to start preparing the tents for the night, while he ordered the others to set up a secure perimeter in the surrounding area and set up several simple traps and alarms to prevent being caught with their pants down during the night. As for Bai Zemin, he along with others spread out at several key points with some elevation in order to observe the surroundings with more clarity as the camp was set up. As he and Meng-Chi chatted quietly on top of a huge pile of rubble that had once formed one of the tallest buildings in the area, Bai Zemin suddenly felt a series of soft, delicate footsteps slowly approaching in their direction. The zombies had already been devoured by the various mutated beasts that inhabited the mountains, so there was no chance that it was one. Moreover, Bai Zemin could sense a familiar aura from the approaching person. Indeed, when Bai Zemin turned to confirm his suspicions, the first thing he saw was a curvaceous silhouette with lustrous fire-red hair and a gorgeous face walking with hesitant steps toward him. Meng-Chi also turned around, but her expression immediately turned ugly when she saw Feng Tianwu walking in their direction. Subconsciously, she took a step forward and stood in front of her big brother as if she was a mother lioness guarding her cubs for fear that they would get hurt. Feng Tianwu probably noticed the hostility and clear hatred in the eyes of the young girl since her steps stopped more than 5 meters away. She raised both hands and said in a clear voice, I don't come here to fight. I just want to talk with you. Bai Zemin looked stupidly behind him as if to make sure no one else was there before looking back at the woman in front of him and saying with genuine astonishment, You want to talk with me? I don't think we have anything to talk about. There was no hatred or disdain in Bai Zemin's voice, but rather his voice was brimming with real astonishment, since in his eyes both he and Feng Tianwu had no reason to interact. Feng Tianwu lowered her hands and frowned slightly before asking in a low voice, You. Do you remember me? Of course, I do remember you. Bai Zemin nodded calmly and pointed. First love is hard to forget regardless of the experiences you had. Well, you've changed a lot since then though. Feng Tianwu sighed and fell silent. She had thought that maybe the young man in front of her didn't remember her at all, or maybe he couldn't recognize her because of the change in her appearance, but now it was clear that this was not the case. Can the two of us talk alone? Feng Tianwu said, looking at Meng-Chi sideways. I would like to apologize with you from the bottom of my heart. I mean it, and not because of your current strength, and not because of your appearance either. I genuinely want to explain my reasons, even though I know I don't deserve to be forgiven. Feng Tianwu paused for a short moment and a somewhat complicated smile appeared on her heroic face as she whispered, although it's not like there's much to explain either. This? Bai Zemin hesitated for a moment before saying with a slight frown, Can't you just say it? My sister isn't very strong and I don't feel safe sending her away from me. However, Meng-Chi surprisingly looked at him and said calmly, No, big brother. I think you need to talk with this woman, both of you calmly. Both Feng Tianwu and Bai Zemin looked at her in surprise. Meng Qi? At her big brother's questioning stare, Meng Qi whispered in a voice low enough for only him to hear. Big brother, you told me earlier that you have a skill called Stone Heart, didn't you? But this skill of yours doesn't seem to evolve even though you have completed all the requirements. If this skill of yours is really related to this Feng Tianwu woman, then there is a possibility that she has something to do with completing the evolution of this skill. Maybe, something like a hidden requirement. Chapter 637 Stone Heart Broken into Pieces. After hearing the reasoning made by Meng Qi, Bai Zemin was surprised and stared at her with a dumbfounded expression on his face. The skill Stone Heart was born as a consequence of his past, this was an undeniable fact. Both Lilith and Bai Zemin speculated that the reason why the skill Stone Heart was born was because those past records that shaped his personality after being betrayed by people he trusted were magnified tremendously as a consequence of the particularly strong soul of Bai Zemin. This was a fact that neither of them could prove yet due to lack of information, but probably wouldn't be too far from reality either. However, Bai Zemin had never considered in retrospect what the birth of the skill Stone Heart meant in more depth. One of the main reasons why this skill was formed was because he and his feelings were betrayed and crushed by the person he once loved, so wouldn't it be reasonable to assume that in order for this skill to disappear or grow further it was first necessary to close that past that was still present? Meng Qi's theory and reasoning suddenly sounded very plausible to Bai Zemin's ears. Maybe, just maybe, he was facing the last lock that was preventing the skill Stone Heart from fully evolving, even though Bai Zemin was 100% sure that his current him loved Lilith. Perhaps the reason why the soul record had not yet crossed out that requirement as fulfilled was because Bai Zemin first needed to put a clear end to the past love and completely let go of any burden he may have inside him at the moment. At the end of the day, regardless of whether Bai Zemin did not hate Feng Tianwu, it was true that he always had a question he wanted to ask her. All right. Bai Zemin nodded after a moment of silence. He looked at Feng Tianwu and said calmly, "Give me a minute." "Sure." Bai Zemin sent Meng Qi glancing over and watched her back until she finally met Shangguan Bing Shui more than 500 meters distant. While he couldn't hear what the two women were talking about, he did manage to faintly watch as Shangguan Bing Shui looked in his direction curiously, her eyes mainly fixed on Feng Tianwu, which meant that at the very least Meng Qi hadn't told her who Feng Tianwu had been to Bai Zemin in the past. So, Bai Zemin turned and looked at Feng Tianwu with a serene expression on his face. "What did you want to talk with me about?" Feng Tianwu suddenly closed her mouth and seemed to have problems finding words to say. She had wanted to talk to the person in front of her for a long time, and now that by things of destiny the two of them met again many years later, she really didn't know quite what to say. She closed her eyes and took a deep breath before opening her eyes again. The eyes of Feng Tianwu met Bai Zemin's, and a glint of resolve flashed in her eyes as she bowed her head and said as honestly as she could, "I apologize for what I did to you in the past. I know you are well within your rights not to forgive me, and I will understand if you choose not to do it. I just wanted to let you know that not too long after that happened. After that happened what happened, I have been regretting it ever since. I know very well that what I did was not correct, so I apologize to you." After saying those words, Feng Tianwu, who was an extremely proud woman to the point that her pride kept everyone away from her, did not raise her head immediately and instead remained silently looking at the ground. She, who only bowed her head before her father, at this moment looked like a weak criminal waiting for the verdict of the magistrate. Bai Zemin had no idea what kind of life the woman in front of him, a woman he had come to love and then hate at some point in his life, had led over the past few years. However, he could tell that Feng Tianwu had really matured a lot and grown tremendously as a person. The sincerity in her every word was more than evident, and the regret in her tone of voice was impossible to mistake. If she was frightened by the strength of Bai Zemin or by the fact that in the near future he might be leading the entire base of the Chinese Renaissance. It was highly unlikely that her words of apology would come from the bottom of her heart. Bai Zemin remained silent for a full minute, a minute during which, while he looked at her without saying a single word, Feng Tianwu did not raise her head to look at him and simply stood there silently as well. Okay. I forgive you. Eh? Feng Tianwu abruptly raised her head and looked at the man in front of her with surprise flashing in her pretty eyes. Bai Zemin smiled slightly and said in a sincere voice, "To be honest with you, Feng Tianwu, it's been a while since I don't hold grudges against you for what happened in the past. Not only do I not hold grudges against you, but the same also goes for Sun Jie. The reason why I beat him yesterday has nothing to do with our past, but because of what you heard during the party." This? Feng Tianwu felt as if her tongue was tangled as no words came out of her mouth. She looked at Bai Zemin with wide eyes and really didn't know what to say, as she could feel his honesty and the sincerity of his words. He was really forgiving her just like that? Feng Tianwu expected to be scorned, she even expected to be humiliated. But what she least expected was to receive such words and in such a tone of voice. She now did not know how she should react or what she should say. "Actually, I have always wanted to ask you a question." "May I?" said Bai Zemin suddenly, taking her by surprise. Oh, of course." Feng Tianwu was still not out of her surprise, and before she knew it she found herself nodding vigorously as if she wanted to at least clean up her past ugly attitude a bit, despite knowing that answering a trivial question wouldn't do it. Bai Zemin nodded, and before he asked his question he sat down on the large pile of rubble. He rested both arms on his knees and leaned his body forward as he rested his chin on his right hand and looked at the woman in front of him with calm eyes. "Do you want to sit down?" He pointed to his left. However, Feng Tianwu shook her head and began to feel very awkward. The more casual Bai Zemin treated her, the more embarrassed and guilty she felt. At this point, Feng Tianwu even wished he would yell at her, pointing his finger at her. Even if he hit her, Feng Tianwu would not complain at all. Unfortunately, in the eyes of the current Bai Zemin, Feng Tianwu was not worth it, and he had no real reason to humiliate her, as any hatred he ever felt for her had died long ago. "Actually, the question I want to ask you is simple. Although it doesn't happen as often as it used to, and we could say it's no longer of great importance to me, occasionally this question pops into my head, and now that we're here I'd like to clarify it." Bai Zemin also rested the other half of his chin on his left fist, and while looking at Feng Tianwu with genuinely curious eyes asked in a perplexed voice, "Would you mind telling me the why?" "Why?" Feng Tianwu looked at him in surprise, as she was expecting a somewhat more direct question. "Yeah, I'd like to know why." Bai Zemin nodded, and as he changed his posture to a more comfortable one he remarked in a voice that contained some self-mockery, "Indeed, I know well that my appearance back then was nothing outstanding. My family also had no power. I had no money. Except for my excellent grades, I know better than anyone that my past self was nothing compared to Sun Jie. But was it really necessary to go to such an extreme?" This was a question that occasionally pricked Bai Zemin's side, but there were no possible means for him to answer on his own. If Feng Tianwu had simply rejected him back then, Bai Zemin's feelings might not have escalated so high, and while he would be sad, he would accept it. But why did she have to do something that cruel? Feng Tianwu smiled bitterly when she heard Bai Zemin's question. She did not dare to look him directly in the eyes as she said in a low voice filled with disdain for herself, "There is no dignified reason, nor is there any logical excuse. The me of that time was just an immature brat who, under the protection of her parents, knew nothing about life. At that time, I thought I was in love with Sun Jie, mistaking my appreciation for his good looks as love. As you said, my then self could never have appreciated a person who came from an ordinary family and whose appearance was of little note." She finally seemed to gather the courage to look at him and with a bitter smile culminated, "No one forced me. That's just the way my past self was. That sweet and kind outward appearance you saw was nothing but a big lie, made up by myself. Bai Zemin's expression did not change at all as he listened to Feng Tianwu's explanation. When she finished, he finally brought both arms behind his body and rested his palms on the rubble as he raised his head to look up at the almost completely black sky. I see. Bai Zemin sighed as a worry-free smile appeared on his face. Thank you for answering, Feng Tianwu, he said suddenly, surprising her again. Bai Zemin lowered his head to look at her and said with a genuine smile, also, thank you for rejecting me back then. Thank you. Are you thanking me for what I did to you? Feng Tianwu's pupils twitched as her lips moved and she whispered in shock. It sounds a bit crazy, I know. Bai Zemin slowly stood up and chuckled. With the end of the sunset behind him, as she looked at that figure standing tall like a mountain, for some reason that she could not understand at that moment, Feng Tianwu felt her heart clench a little. But, I am genuinely grateful to you. Bai Zemin stretched both arms to shake off the laziness in his body and said in a clear voice, thanks to you rejecting me back then, today I was able to meet the woman I genuinely love. A woman I do love for real, and not a fake image that never existed. Bang! Bai Zemin felt something deep in his soul shatter into pieces, and he immediately felt lighter. He closed his eyes and bathed in the not-so-warm breeze of the impending night, and as the messages flashed across his retina, he whispered softly, if the one I loved never existed, then I don't think that was really love. Congratulations! All evolution requirements have been successfully fulfilled. Do you wish to evolve the skill Stone Heart to the next order? Bai Zemin chuckled and said in a clear voice, you really like playing with me, don't you? Soul Record. Although he did not give a 100% clear answer, maybe, the entity known as Soul Record, that seemingly omnipotent being who had the life of the entire universe in its control, understood his intention, by feeling the beating of his now free heart. Evolving skill. Congratulations, you have unlocked a unique 4th order skill. You have learned the passive skill Immovable Heart. Chapter 638 Stone Heart to Immovable Heart, a Women's Magnet. Immovable Heart, 4th Order Unique Skill, LVL4. Having conquered the past completely to focus on today for the sake of a better tomorrow, your willpower and determination increase tremendously. Your current self knows what it wants, and the likelihood of wavering towards what you want decreases. Self-confidence increases your charm enormously the longer you talk with people of the opposite sex. First passive effect, negatively focused side effects of the user's skills are weakened by half. Second passive effect, the effects of active or passive skills launched by third parties that affect the mentality, rationality, or heart of the possessor of the skill Immovable Heart are automatically cancelled with a maximum limit of up to 3 orders above the possessor. Bai Zemin slowly opened his eyes, and as the green letters disappeared from his retina to merge with his soul, he faced with a carefree smile, looking at the growing darker and starry sky. More than feeling joy or surprise at the surprisingly strong effects of the skill Immovable Heart, what Bai Zemin felt most was liberation. Now, at this moment, he could say with complete confidence that the past for him was nothing more than a walked past. Now, he could focus on the things that really mattered in the way he believed was right. A strong gust of wind rushed through the area and the crimson-red hair of Feng Tianwu danced uncontrollably, giving her the appearance of a beautiful goddess but also of a brave warrior. She stood silently as her beautiful eyes stared blankly at the young man a few feet ahead. Feng Tianwu really wanted to ask him how he could smile like that. She really wanted to know how he was able to show such a carefree and kind smile in front of the person who had once caused him so much pain. Sun Jie had told her years ago that the person who had broken his legs had been Bai Zemin, and while no one had believed him back then because Bai Zemin was in a state of total depression, Feng Tianwu, who thought she was in love, did believe him. She even despised Bai Zemin in her heart for being a person who did not wake up from his dream world. But it was not until now that Feng Tianwu finally understood that probably the reason why Bai Zemin broke Sun Jie's legs at that time was not because of her, not out of jealousy, but out of pain. Pain and anger after being betrayed by his best friend, the one he trusted with all his heart. After several seconds, Bai Zemin took a deep breath and let out all that air he was holding in a single blow. He looked at the woman standing in front of him and said with a faint smile, "I guess now I should thank you once again." Feng Tianwu just looked at him silently. She was finding it difficult to understand the kind of person the young man in front of her was. The Bai Zemin in front of her was simply too different from the Bai Zemin in her memories, not only physically, but his attitude and personality were also completely different from what Feng Tianwu could remember. The Bai Zemin in front of her looked countless times more confident compared to his past self, confidence which like a magnet attracted the eyes of others and made them rely on him. Moreover, the young man in front of her also looked determined and assertive, far from that Bai Zemin who looked at the world with hesitant eyes just like a tiger that had been taken out of the forest he belonged to and thrown into the city. "You? What are you?" Her brain was still trying to process what was going on when her mouth moved of its own accord. Bai Zemin chuckled and shook his head slightly without saying anything at the woman's weird question before him. While he did not hate Feng Tianwu in any way and no longer held the slightest bit of resentment for the past, this did not mean that Bai Zemin had forgotten what she did to him. Having no resentment or hatred was very different from forgetting. Therefore, Bai Zemin had no intention of befriending Feng Tianwu. As such, he naturally would not share any of his deepest secrets. Consequently, he would not tell her that in part because of her he now possessed a tremendously powerful skill. Friendship was something that was earned with trust, and unfortunately or not, Feng Tianwu was not someone Bai Zemin could trust no matter how much she seemed to have changed. "Looks like the others finished with setting up the camp," Bai Zemin said suddenly, snapping Feng Tianwu out of her daze. He jumped down from the large pile of rubble and as he walked towards the center of the town he looked over his shoulder and said with a faint smile, "We should go too." Feng Tianwu watched him walk further away and even though she wanted to move forward she for some reason could not take a step ahead and follow him. After several seconds, she called out, "Aren't you going to ask me anything?" Bai Zemin stopped and still without turning around looked at her over his shoulder in confusion. "Ask you?" Feng Tianwu took a deep breath and said in a low voice, "About what happened after we each took our own paths. Don't you want to know?" "Oh. You mean about what happened between you and Sun Jie?" Bai Zemin suddenly got enlightened. However, he shrugged his shoulders and said in a flat voice, "It's none of my business, and being honest with you, I don't have a hobby of sticking my nose into other people's relationships either." Then, he turned and walked away leaving behind some last words. "You apologized, I forgave you. You will go on with your life the same way you have been and I will go on with my life the way I think is best to live it. That's all, there is no more." Feng Tianwu watched as his back disappeared beyond the turn of the corner, covered by debris that had been lifted as a means of partially blocking the wind, and after almost 2 whole minutes of standing in silence she smiled bitterly and said under her breath, "For some reason, I now feel worse than I did before." But Feng Tianwu was not a weak-minded woman either. She soon gently smacked her face and her firm expression returned to it. Her footsteps never faltered again as she moved forward resolutely toward the central camp. Immediately after returning to the center of what had once been Xingshou town, a place where more than 100 tents reinforced with all kinds of mutant animal hides had now been erected, Bai Zemin called several people and ordered them to inform the leaders of the respective guilds to meet him at his tent in 20 minutes. Then, he made sure that the food preparations went smoothly before finally making a quick inspection of the traps and alarms that had been set up in a 1-kilometer perimeter. The traps that had been set consisted mostly of a series of mines in irregular patterns, but whose locations were carefully thought out in such a way that even an existence with the ability to detect them would have trouble avoiding a safe path in or out. As for the alarms, they were actually several glass bottles held together by wires placed at ground level so that a small hitch was all that was needed for the bottles to fall from high above and explode against the ground, acting as an emergency alarm clock in the event of an ambush. In addition, there would be patrols constantly changing shifts every 2 hours in order that the security guards would always be at their maximum possible strength. About 10 minutes later, Bai Zemin went into his tent which had been set up in the center, right next to Sun Ling's tent since they were both leader and deputy leader in this operation. There, Bai Zemin met his little sister Meng Qi, Shangguan Bing Shui, Wu Yijuan, Chen He, Zhong De, Sun Ling, Nangong Lingxin, and Kai Jingyi. Big brother. Meng Qi stood up when she saw him but suddenly hesitated and stopped herself from what she was going to say. She really wanted to ask how everything had gone, but with so many people present, maybe it wasn't the best idea. So, in the end, she looked at him hoping he would understand her questioning. Of course, having spent so much time together in the past, it was impossible for him not to understand something so simple. Everything turned out fine. In fact, you were right. Bai Zemin chuckled and sat down on a cut tree trunk next to the large makeshift table that had been built using part of a mutant tree. They hadn't brought many luxuries on this operation as it was meant to last only 2 or 3 days at most, and then they would return to base to report whatever it was they had found. Meng Qi sighed in relief and a beautiful smile naturally bloomed on her face, brightening the atmosphere tremendously. Bai Zemin walked over and under everyone's surprised eyes gently kissed the top of her head. Thank you, Meng Qi. If not for you, if anything happened to her before I could clear all this up, it's probable that I would never have been able to make it. The very thought made Bai Zemin tremble with fear but also wonder at how mysterious destiny was sometimes. Meng Qi just smiled sweetly and said nothing even though she felt proud that she could help her big brother grow stronger. However, the same could not be said for the people inside the tent. Hearing the words she and her, everyone realized that Bai Zemin seemed to have met with a woman and somehow or other this woman was clearly someone important to him. However, no one understood what was going on since other than those present, Bai Zemin should be unfamiliar with any of the other soul evolvers or soldiers who came to this operation. Only Shangguan Bing Shui frowned slightly as she recalled what happened a few minutes ago. However, despite her curiosity, she restrained herself from asking anything since, like Meng Qi, she also believed that it was not right to ask too personal questions when there were so many people present. Bai Zemin chatted with the people inside his tent for about 5 minutes when suddenly Sun Ling looked at him, somewhat puzzled, and said in confusion, "Little brother Zemin, is it just me? Or has something in you changed recently?" In fact, it was not only Wu Yijuan's mother who noticed the small but noticeable change in him. The past Bai Zemin talked and looked at practically everyone with a certain indifference and weariness, but the present him talked and looked at people with confidence and pride that seemed to come from his very soul, and as if he feared nothing and no one. "This madam, could you please stop using the term little brother on my husband?" Lilith said suddenly, and a pout formed on her charming face as she said with hidden bitterness, "Only I can call him little brother after all." Of course, no one but Bai Zemin himself could hear Lilith, so he didn't know whether to laugh or cry when he heard her complaints. Moreover, it seemed to be that Lilith was really happy at this moment since she even dared to refer to him as my husband even though she was usually quite shy about this matter. Consequently, Bai Zemin smiled happily as the happier his beloved the happier he would naturally be. "Indeed, Aunt Sunday." He did not deny it and said confidently, "You could say that after freeing myself from a certain minor burden I am now something like a new man, so I see." Sun Ling nodded and suddenly smiled like a little fox as she said in a joking tone, "Your current aura is really attractive, you know? Now even I feel like I could contend against my daughter for your future affection." "Mom." Wu Yijuan looked at her mother in shock and embarrassedly kicked her under the table, making her jump slightly. "Girl, I fed you as a little girl and even raised you in the best possible way. Is it so hard for you to share your man with me?" Sun Ling said with fake tears in her eyes. Her personality was really mischievous as she suddenly sighed dreamily and said in a whispering voice, "I still remember when my little Yijuan used to sleep with me in the same bed. But since she grew up she no longer wanted to share a bed with me, embarrassed by her father." "Mother, stop it or I'll get mad at you." Wu Yijuan kicked her again with an apple-red face from under the table, but Sun Ling clearly wasn't going to stop. Just like that, as she suddenly took Bai Zemin's hands between hers and said in a pleading voice, "Little brother Zemin. No, big brother. It's up to you to let me sleep in the same bed with my daughter again. Since she won't sleep with me because of her father, then I have no choice but to sleep with you so that she won't refuse anymore. Xietain, like everyone else inside the tent, was dumbfounded as he stared at the beautiful and seductive face of the woman in front of him who was looking at him with shining black fox-like eyes as if he was her only hope. What the fuck was going on here, he wondered quietly in silence. Then, Lilith's funny voice sounded next to him. It's really interesting. Stoneheart practically made your attitude drive women away somehow, but after evolving into a movable heart, your attitude seems to attract women very naturally. Chapter 639, The Classic Carrot and Stick. Earlier, during his inspection of the terrain and after leaving Feng Tianwu, Xietain had shared with Lilith his new skill after Stoneheart finally evolved. Lilith at that moment was incredibly happy but also very shy since the evolution of Stoneheart meant that Xietain was effectively in love with her and that the words he had said to her at that moment in the middle of the desert were not empty words. He knew that he was in love with her even if the soul record had not approved of it yet. After seeing the effects of the new skill Immovable Heart, Lilith simply vowed to herself to never again be surprised by the crazy skills that Xietain might obtain in the future. As for whether she would achieve such a thing or not remained to be seen. Be that as it may, the effect that most caught Lilith's attention was the increase in natural charm for those of the opposite sex. After all, Stoneheart was a skill meant for Xietain to stay away from women, but its evolution practically pushed women to him. Xietain really wanted to retort to Lilith's words, but wisely decided not to say anything as not only would he be seen as a lunatic for speaking to the air, but there was no need to say anything in the first place. To everyone's shock, Xietain actually turned his hands around and took the soft and delicate hands of Wu Yijuan's mother between his own, intertwining their fingers. Looking into the eyes of the woman in front of him who was old enough to be his mother, he said in a soft voice, "Aunt Sun, if you are willing to leave Uncle Wu and come with me, then I will gladly make you happy." Chenhe, Kai Jingyi, Nangong Lingxin, Zhongda, Wu Yijuan, Meng Qi. Shangguan Bingshui raised an eyebrow and silently tossed a chocolate mani into her mouth as she looked at Xietain with amusement and finally realized that it wasn't just her that had received a minor readjustment in the personality. It looked like things might get more interesting in the future, and for some reason, Shangguan Bingshui felt anxious like a little girl eager to open her Christmas present. Even Sun Ling was astonished as she looked at the young man who was young enough to be her son but that boldly and confidently dared to take her hands even though he knew she was married. As if that wasn't enough, that same young man was the target of her daughter's affection. Sun Ling just wanted to tease him and her daughter Wu Yijuan a bit, but little did she expect that she would eventually end up in this kind of situation. Of course, it's a joke. Xietain let go of Sun Ling's hands and leaned back. "Aunt Sun, you should stop teasing Yijuan or she might really get mad at you." "Oh, okay." Sun Ling found herself nodding, still looking at him with wide eyes. Xietain looked at Wu Yijuan and realized that the girl's face was as red as a ripe tomato, and for a second he couldn't help but worry whether she was going to explode or not. As for the reaction of the others, he didn't care at all. The only thing Xietain did was to gesture to Shangguan Bingshui secretly to indicate that he would explain to her later, since she really seemed curious about it. Approximately 5 minutes later, several people entered the tent being led by a soldier armed in a strange combination of modern weaponry and medieval-style armor. 6 people, among whom it could be said that Xietain knew 3 of them. On one side was Huang Tian, leader of the Black Turtle Guild. Feng Hong, father of Feng Tianwu, and whom Xietain had recently learned was actually the leader of the Phoenix Guild. Finally, Feng Tianwu herself, whose level was 45, but whose power allowed her to fight on equal footing against a level 50 First Order existence, while playing the role of the leader of the Phoenix Guild's elite team. As for the other 3, this was the first time Xietain had met them, but he had read information about them on the way here, thanks to the documents Wu Yijuan's father bothered to prepare for him. One of them was an old man who seemed on the verge of death as he staggered with every step he took and was as thin as a stick, so it seemed that the next gust of wind might blow him away. However, this decrepit old man named Lian Jing was actually a powerful level 50 assassin in the middle of his breakthrough mission and leader of the White Tiger Guild. According to rumors, his special job was the reason for his current appearance, even though his life expectancy was stronger than ever. The other was a young man who looked to be around Bai Zemin's age and seemed friendly enough. Black hair, dark eyes, a rather handsome appearance, and wouldn't have anything too remarkable if it weren't for the green-scaled snake that coiled from the bottom of his right foot and ran his full height to the extension of his opposite arm. His name was Tinghua, a powerful level 50 soul evolver close to breaking into the Second Order and leader of the Blue Dragon Guild. Finally, the eyes of Bai Zemin rested on the last person, and a peculiar glint flash shone in them. This last person was a woman who looked between 25 and 27 years old, quite beautiful with wavy black hair, an oval face, and a delightful body. However, none of this was the reason why Bai Zemin focused on her. This woman's name was Xietain, and she was the leader of the special forces of hidden soul evolvers that Wu Keqian had secretly formed without anyone else knowing about it. He called these special forces as the Fifth Guild, the Xietain Guild. The thing was that surprisingly, Bai Zemin had no idea how strong this woman was. Was Xietain stronger than Bai Zemin? Was her soul power purer or so abundant that he could not compare? Neither Bai Zemin nor anyone who knew a fraction of his power would believe such a thing even if they were beaten to death. Therefore, Xietain probably owned a treasure that stopped any leakage of soul power. Thank you all for coming just as I asked. Bai Zemin nodded in their direction, standing up as a sign of respect for strong and brave people. Huang Tian, the old Liang Jing, Snake Youth Tinghua, Feng Hong, and Xietain nodded toward him and saluted with respect. Feng Tianwu did so as well, but clearly still felt a bit awkward as her eyes were erratic whenever she looked forward. All of us here are all people whose time is worth too much, so I won't beat around the bush, Bai Zemin said in a deep serious voice, except for Xietain, whose mission was specially delegated by Mayor Wu to protect his wife General Sun and his daughter Wu Yijuan. All of you and the troops below you will have to listen to my commands and follow them to the letter. This? Liang Jing looked at Bai Zemin with his small eyes and said somewhat hesitantly, Leader, about the guilds. That's what I was getting at, thanks for pointing it out. Bai Zemin nodded calmly. To this day, the four guilds have been fighting their own battles despite being on the same battlefield. While this is good in its own way, as dividing tasks is not bad, my combat style and leadership differ considerably from Mayor Wu's and probably any other commander you have had so far. Bai Zemin observed the expression of the new arrivals and noticed that Feng Hong, Liang Jing, Tinghua, and Huang Tian looked somewhat dissatisfied. It was clear that the competition among the four guilds was fierce and they all wanted to compete for merits and benefits. I don't care how strong each of you may be. If you don't know how to follow orders, then you are of no use to me. Numbers are important without a doubt, but I always aimed for quality rather than quantity. And considering my position as the founding leader of a faction with over 30,000 survivors, I don't think my approach is wrong. Bai Zemin showed no mercy with his words, to the point where Sun Ling, who didn't know him too well, became a little worried. At this rate, wouldn't the operation end up being a failure even before it officially began? But in fact, while 30,000 survivors might not be too much in the eyes of a colossus like the Chinese Renaissance, the important factor here was that those 30,000 survivors had been united under a single standard. After being saved by an ordinary college student who did not have the support of any official title or power, as was the case with Wu Keqian at the beginning of the apocalypse. Suddenly, Bai Zemin smiled slightly and said with confidence, I know you are not satisfied, and the only reason you are not saying anything is because you know I am strong. However, while I like to enforce the rules and severely punish those who break them, I also reward juicily those who obey. The ears of the dissatisfied immediately perked up at Bai Zemin's words, and it was obvious that they were now listening to him more eagerly than before. The 4 guilds will continue to exist as the subdivision of powers is interesting, but instead of the leader of each guild having the final word, the role of each of you will be to transmit and ensure that my orders are carried out. If any of you disobey, then once I take over the base, you can dream of holding a high position regardless of how strong you are. However, if you perform well, I will reward each of you 4 with a second-order soul stone after my Transcendent faction and the Chinese Renaissance faction merge. How about that? Second-order soul stone? 1 to each of them? Huang Tian exchanged glances with the other 3 guild leaders as they gasped in shock. Even Sun Ling looked at Bai Zemin with wide eyes as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. This? Second-order soul stone? 4 of them? You're really not kidding? Sun Ling really was incredulous. The entire Chinese Renaissance faction only had 3 second-order soul stones, and they were treated as ultimate treasures. Even her husband Wu Keqian didn't dare to casually spend them to evolve any skills as he believed it was a waste, but the young man in front of her actually boasted that he could casually take out 4 and casually give them away. Joking? Bai Zemin looked at the beautiful mature woman standing right next to him taking the place as the deputy leader and said in a serious voice, "Do you even think that I am in this place making jokes? If every one of my serious words were nothing but jokes, then there is no way that people as powerful as them would be willing to follow me, don't you think?" Saying that, Bai Zemin pointed at Shangguan Bing Shui, Chen He, Wu Yijuan, Kai Jingyi, Zhong De, and finally Nanbong Lingxin. Shangguan Bing Shui nodded and said indifferently, "There is no need to be doubtful. He really is capable of taking out 4 second-order soul stones and handing them out as rewards without shaking the foundation of our Transcendent faction at all." Wu Yijuan and Chen He also rallied to support Bai Zemin, leaving Sun Ling with no choice but to believe him. At the end of the day, there was no reason to lie when his power was so high, and in fact lying would only affect his future if his eventual goal really was to conquer China. Ha ha ha. Since the leader is putting it that way, this old man will honestly listen to your orders. Liang Jing laughed so hard that he soon began to cough and staggered several steps as if he was really going to collapse soon. Feng Tianwu's father, Teng Hua, and Huang Tian nodded and quickly accepted Bai Zemin's proposition. What a joke! With a second-order soul stone, they could evolve their main skills to the next order, or if they wanted to, they could sell it to the base for enough resources to live a life of luxury for years. Bai Zemin smiled slightly and his eyes glistened with satisfaction. And seeing that peculiar smile on his face, Shangguan Bing Shui and everyone else who knew the kind of person he was and his means realized that by the time this operation was over, the strongest soul evolvers from the 4 guilds that had been sent on this operation would most likely become devoted to him. It was not the first time such a thing had happened, and it surely would not be the last. Chapter 640 Asian Weaver Ant. Inside Bai Zemin's tent, the meeting among the strongest and most important people in this operation went on for about another 20 minutes after sealing the previous deal. Finally, after about 30 minutes in total, the leaders of the 4 guilds, Xia and Feng Tianwu, left after being dismissed by Bai Zemin, remaining inside the tent those who were originally there when Bai Zemin arrived. The group was adjusting some minor details when a soldier reported from outside that dinner had been prepared, so they left everything as it was and walked out of the tent. Although the dinner was not as sumptuous and luxurious as people with high power were used to eating, such as Sun Ling, Bai Zemin, Wu Yiju, Shangguan Bing Shui, Chen He, and many more, this did not mean that it was not delicious. Although it was just white rice with some sautéed vegetables and small pieces of meat interspersed, the vegetables that grew in the evolved land and nourished with the manna of the world did not lose in flavor with the juicy mutant meat at all. Sun Ling watched Bai Zemin's every move in silence, as apart from being part of the scouting operation, she also had to see if the young man was really worthy of being handed everything on a silver platter. His strength seemed to be an undeniable fact, and while he had not yet demonstrated very much, it was clear that, in terms of speed and strength, he surpassed Wu Keqian. the most powerful soul evolver of the entire Chinese Renaissance. Now it was time to study his ability and leadership style. However, Sun Ling was amazed to see how during dinner he mingled among the normal soul evolvers, casually chatting and even engaging in a joke or two that made several of them laugh. In fact, all the higher-ups were slightly separated from the others, perhaps to avoid being seen as friends by the lower-ranking soldiers and soul evolvers, which could lead to a decrease in the importance of their words when giving orders. Is he always like this? Sun Ling asked in a whispering voice to her daughter who was sitting next to her. Eh? Wu Yijuan blinked uncomprehendingly before looking at Bai Zemin and finally realizing what her mother was talking about. Wu Yijuan looked at her in confusion and asked, curiously, yes, he's always like that. Why? In military operations, generals interact as little as possible with normal soldiers. This is because they want to prevent soldiers in times of crisis from mistaking small talk for friendship, which could lead to crucial problems. Chen He intervened from the side and calmly pointed out, even in ancient times it was the same. Bai Zemin is a strange kind of leader, don't try to understand him. Nangong Lingxin shook her head and pointed out, many times he is cruel to the point that even I dare not look him in the eyes, however, many other times he is so kind that even the coldest person in the world cannot help but be moved. Sun Ling nodded silently as she listened to the opinions of those who had spent the most time fighting alongside Bai Zemin, and slowly an image began to form in her head. The next day. It was early in the morning and the sun had not yet risen when each of the soldiers and soul evolvers began to work to clear the camp under the careful inspection of the High Command. Approximately 20 minutes later, the group of approximately 600 people began to walk south, directly towards the forest that was only a few kilometers away. This time they were only on foot and left the vehicles behind since in the woods driving was impossible and noise would probably not be too dear an ally. Bai Zemin ordered the lower-level soul evolvers to carry the tents and tactical backpacks where things like food, clothes, weapons, etc. were stored. In this kind of situation, in his eyes it was more important to have a soldier equipped with a machine gun, rather than a level 10 soul evolver whose soul power was trash. It would take some time to change this as these soul evolvers were not the ones he had trained in his transcendent faction. While Bai Zemin had his storage ring, he would not reveal it so easily. A treasure of such a high grade was enough to make the eyes of many turn green as greedy wolves, and while he was not fearful of problems he was not fanatical about them either. Approximately 30 minutes later, Bai Zemin managed to spot the forest less than 300 meters in front, so he stopped and looked at the people next to him as he calmly said, "Remember that you only have to protect the flanks and rear. The front belongs to me, understood?" Huang Tian, the old assassin Liang Jing, the young man with the snake Ting Hua, and Feng Tian Wu's father Feng Hong nodded toward him. The four of them had state-of-the-art military radios, so they quickly transmitted Bai Zemin's words before splitting up into different flanks. Bai Zemin nodded in satisfaction as he saw the performance of these people. Then, he looked at the nothingness in front of him and commanded in a deep voice, "Go. But don't go too deep." "Roger." Kai Jingyi's voice sounded a short distance ahead and the space seemed to tremble slightly before everything went silent again. "Meng Qi, you and Little Snow follow me from close behind," Bai Zemin said as he resumed his march. "Remember what I told you earlier?" "Yes." Meng Qi nodded with a resolute expression on her face. Little Snow let out a low little howl in reply, which earned a pat from Shangguan Bing Shui to the big white dog's delight. She had even slept in Bai Zemin's tent next to Meng Qi just for the sake of being close to Little Snow's beautiful soft fur, not to Bai Zemin's surprise. Of course, Bai Zemin's tent was not peaceful that night, as taking the opportunity Wu Yijuan also decided to stay, which led to Sun Ling also staying for the night, and eventually even Chen He had his place there. Be that as it may, while Bai Zemin recalled events of the previous night, the group stepped into the forest and advanced carefully. The soldiers raised their machine guns and rifles high with nervous expressions on their faces, as this was the first time they had actually gone into a forest. Even the soul evolvers were clutching their combat weapons with some trembling in their hands as even they were beginning to lose vision once the sun's rays had difficulty piercing the top of the mutant trees. Swoosh! The group had not walked more than 5 minutes when a purple shadow flashed toward them at full speed from the left side. The soldiers barely had time to react when a clear, unwavering voice rang out amidst the silence. Burning flare. Updated from FREEWEBNOVEL.com. The surroundings brightened as a burst of fire flew out from Feng Tianwu's outstretched palms and with a loud bang hit a silhouette that was in mid-leap a few meters in front of her. The silhouette's body was sent flying engulfed in a ball of fire, but it didn't even have time to writhe in pain, since as soon as it hit the ground the flames began to extinguish, revealing nothing but scorched bones and a pile of black ashes. The surroundings were still dimly lit as small particles of fire floated in the air, slowly spreading. Bai Zemin looked at Feng Tianwu and without him saying anything she looked in his direction and said in a clear voice, "Unclassified, level 15. Bai Zemin nodded and calmly ordered, "All soul evolvers below level 13 step in. Only those above level May 13th remain on the outer perimeter." Soon, several orders were transmitted and the group formation became smaller and tighter in comparison. Bai Zemin waited for a bit and immediately received the news that the right flank barely had any melee-type soul evolvers, so he looked at Nangong Lingxin silently. "Leave it to me." She nodded and soon disappeared in a westerly direction. Sun Ling and Xia nodded silently as they understood Bai Zemin's plan. Decrease casualties, avoid burdens, have emergency troops, and there was even the possibility of empowering them depending on the situation. All had been covered with a couple of simple orders, but which to be carried out needed powerful warriors capable of withstanding large loads of enemies on their own. The group continued to advance, except that this time Bai Zemin moved forward a couple of meters next to Meng Qi and Little Snow. He guided them and let both Meng Qi and Little Snow level up, but Bai Zemin only let them kill creatures of a higher level than them. Of course, he contributed his little bit to greatly weaken those enemies so that it was not difficult for them to obtain some of that soul power which was tremendously pure for them. So far, most of the enemies were coming from the front or the sides, but with Bai Zemin in front and with soul evolvers of level 30 or above taking the reins on the flanks, they had not suffered any casualties even after they had been inside the mutant forest for about half an hour and had walked for a couple of kilometers. Approximately another 20 minutes later, the trio hadn't taken more than a few steps into the darkness after taking the life of a level 24 unclassified mutant beast when one of the bushes a few meters ahead trembled lightly. Bai Zemin had no time to say anything as Little Snow shot forward and disappeared into the shadows. Soon after, the big white dog appeared dragging the corpse of a large ant whose color ranged from light green to reddish, which was over a meter long and over half a meter tall. "Ant?" Bai Zemin's face changed slightly and he hurriedly but in a composed voice ordered, "Turn on the lights." Several mages in the center of the formation raised both hands to the sky and called out the name of different active skills. At the same time, 2 soldiers stationed at opposite points raised several flares and fired them into the sky. The flares along with lightning, fire, and light magic immediately illuminated everything for more than 1,000 meters around, and when the group that had not yet suffered a single casualty managed to see more clearly what was around them, they were almost scared to death. Mutant ants whose size was comparable to that of a dog in the past world were crawling carefully toward them and, at this moment they were no more than 100 meters distant. They stared at them with their large black eyes and the antennae on their heads moved in cutting motions as sticky saliva slid out of their mouths and fell to the ground constantly. The problem was not only that they seemed to come in numbers that easily exceeded 500,000 but also what kind of ant they were. "Weaver ant!" Meng Qi exclaimed in alarm. The Asian weaver ant was one of the strongest ant species in the entire world. They were not poisonous, nor did they contain any corrosive acids in their saliva, although their blood did contain formic acid which could cause a lot of pain. The real problem was that these ants were capable of lifting objects up to 100 times their weight, so their strength was terrifying. Fortunately, however, the weaver ant was also quite slow. Feng Hong. Chen He. Feng Tian Wu. The three of you protect the two flanks and the rear. I'll take care of the front. Bai Zemin ordered in a deep voice and did not dare to underestimate this enemy. Bing Shui, Yiguan, you two will lead the others to provide support to anyone who needs it, and don't let the weaver ants get too close. Okay. Wu Yiguan nodded with a serious expression and soon began to throw several mutant seeds all over the place, preparing her magic. No problem. Shangguan Bing Shui nodded with a faint smile and several ice particles glowed around her, giving her the appearance of a frost goddess before disappearing underground, probably a new skill or the evolution of an old one. Bai Zemin sighed in relief as he saw how Shangguan Bing Shui was still standing and did not faint as happened back then when the army of wolf spiders attacked. While Bai Zemin or Shangguan Bing Shui could wipe out this large army of weaver ants on their own, this operation was not just about pure force, but it was necessary to prove that he was capable of leading. It was the only way Bai Zemin could avoid clashing with Wu Yiguan's family, and thus he was delighted to be able to do it the easy way. The only thing that worried Bai Zemin was the fact that there might be a nest. If that was the case, then it would be a headache.